Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today as I interview Christian Adam, one of the authors of Policy Accumulation and the Democratic Responsiveness Trap. This book was recently reviewed in the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, Research and Practice. JCPA is the premier journal for studies of comparative policy analysis and comparative policy studies. As such, we strive to engage with scholarship in the field of the highest caliber. Thank you for joining me, Christian. I have a few questions regarding your book and your perspective on the contribution of the book to our field. So I think the easiest and first one is, how did the book come about? What kind of conversations were you and your co-authors having that led to this research?
Yeah, thanks for having me. The book grew out of two rather large international data collection efforts and previous projects, one focusing on environmental and social policies, and the other on morality policy developments in a lot of OECD countries. And to make it quite easy, the task or the realization was that everybody was involved in coding later years in the policies, in these respective policies, had a lot more to do than people involved in coding the early years in these different policy sectors, which led us to the realization that, which might be quite obvious to once you realize that for the first time, was that policy complexity in basically all of these issues has, for very different reasons, increased tremendously over the last 5 or 6 decades in basically all of those OECD countries that we looked at.
And so what do we learn with your book? What is the main message of policy accumulation and the democratic responsiveness trap? What is it that you would like the readers to get out of your book?
I think two things. The first is probably the case that it might be worthwhile to not only study policy change and try to explain policy change, which is the predominant focus in the field. Because as we argue, and I think show quite substantially, that policy change does not come about in the typical form as we assume by throwing previous elements of policy mixes out and bringing new policy instruments or elements into this mix. So it's not a simple substitution of policy. Much more frequently or empirically more important is actually the addition and expansion of these policy mixes, because for very different reasons, it seems politically much more opportune to layer, to add on, to expand existing mixes than to engage in substantial substitution. And so I think the one contribution that we'd like to make is to raise an awareness and an interest of the scholarly community, the policy community, to study these patterns and particularities of the politics of these accumulation processes.
Thank you so much, Christian. So your book is part of the Cambridge Studies in Comparative Public Policy, right? And that means that your book contributes and engages with questions of comparative public policy. How does the book engage with these questions of comparative public policy and comparative policy analysis? If you could tell us in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, again, it has a lot to do with the focus that we're trying to motivate other scholars to adopt. When we're conducting comparative policy analysis, we tend to think a lot about variance and differences between different countries. What we do in this book is quite different in the regard that we're actually focusing on one commonality, rather uniform trend across very, very different countries, which we might lose out of sight to some extent when we're always focusing on trying to explain variance and variation between different countries. So I think a little bit more focus on trying to explain striking similarities and uniform trends across different countries is something that comparative public policy can profit from sometimes.
Definitely. So your book, in my view, focuses on a relatively large number of cases. Is this the direction that comparative policy studies will go, or are we going back to the low end kind of studies? Where do you think we should go, right? Like this is a really interesting collective effort by several authors, right? Like you're the lead author, and is large N again, or are we going into medium N? What kind of work do you think? And perhaps this is more a question of enjoyment, right? Like what kind of work would you enjoy doing more, right? Like medium N, large N, low N, etc.
Yeah, in my personal work, I always try to find a balance between the two, and I hope that's also the way for the field. I mean, even in this book, I mean, descriptively, we focus on a lot of different countries and describe this pattern with quantitative indicators for a huge variety of countries and very long time periods. But actually, the qualitative examples with which we try to substantiate our theoretical arguments, they are mostly, not exclusively, but they mostly focus on specific German case studies, right? So one case that we know quite well, or think we know quite well, and where we're actually able to work out and establish the different mechanisms that we're describing in more detail. So I hope that that the field keeps both of these arms, and that they, yeah, I think we've realized for a long time that they actually can work quite well together as long as we focus on similar concepts and similar aims.
I really like how I teach comparative methods and I teach research methods. So this is a fantastic interview to have my students watch and look at questions of variation, policy change, and comparison. And I think those are really important questions, which leads me to the next question. So where do you see this research going? What are your next steps, yours as a researcher and your colleagues after this book?
I think it has already started. One of the lead authors, Christoph Knill, has won a grant where he develops one of those aspects in more detail, where he focuses on the impact of policy accumulation and potentially systematically increasing implementation problems. This is definitely one line of research that we as a group are trying to deepen and to pursue in more detail. But also the other elements in the book where we focus on the implications of policy accumulation, for example, on the qualitative aspects of policy debates in the public arena, as well as on our potential to engage in or to convince people on the basis of evidence about good and bad policy choices. I think both of these strands of research that are dedicated or that are addressed in different chapters in the book, we were trying to engage in more research, trying to establish the theses and the hypotheses that we put forward in the book more substantially with additional research. So we're basically, to be brief, we're trying to we're trying to create additional research to substantiate the hypothesis in a more robust way in the future.
So your book, contrary to what a lot of other books do, your book actually presents a lot of interrelated concepts, right? Like policy accumulation, democracy, and democratic responsiveness, and so on. So which one would you say is the core concept, right? To me, sort of the foundational concept is policy accumulation. What is policy accumulation for our readers, the readers of JCPA, and the people who watch this interview?
Yeah, I agree. Policy accumulation is the key concept here, and we're trying to explore the the impacts of this accumulation process on the legitimacy of democratic governance or government, in different arenas. And this accumulation process, I think, is best illustrated when we think about the growing complexity and density of rules, policy instruments, and elements, government programs in any kind of area of government activity. So it's not a very narrowly defined concept. It's a rather broad concept which should be associated with this growing density of rules, this growing complexity and comprehensiveness of policy mixes. It has sometimes in other literature strands also been described as a growing volume of law, which basically defines or basically is associated with this process of policy accumulation. It speaks a lot to complexity.
Absolutely. And the second issue is democracy. So you talk about the democratic responsiveness trap. How would you describe for a more or less lay audience what is the democratic responsiveness trap?
We argue that democratic governments are obviously under constant pressure to be responsive to citizen demands in the various policy areas. They try to do so. And but the way they are only able to do so is politically by expanding and extending existing policy mixes, because it's politically very often difficult to terminate existing policies, to abolish existing policies. We've known that for a long time from research on policy termination. And it shows empirically that governments tend to respond to citizen demands, not by bringing in new elements to policy mixes, but by extending them, by making them larger, by making them more complex. So this is actually a quite good process, right? It's a very good thing. We get better environmental regulation. We get more social rules, ideally more social protection, and so forth. At the same time, all these policies that accumulate, the existing rules, government programs, etc., they have to be implemented, or at least enforced, monitored, and so forth. And this is not a trivial task. Now, when we consider that the public sector has been public sector employment, for example, has stalled and stagnated in most countries, or even decreased in many countries, where we've tried to trim and optimize public sectors for efficiency, not certainly effectiveness. The growing compliance costs and administrative compliance costs that grow out of these more complex policy mixes create an increasing gap between existing resources, administrative resources and capacities to implement, monitor, and enforce public policies, and the workload existing for these implementers, enforcers, and monitorers. So that's one area where we see an increasing gap between what has to be done and what should be done and what can actually be done. Secondly, we think it affects, this process of accumulation affects our ability to debate public policy, particularly in the public arena, which depends or relies a lot on brevity, conciseness, the thing I struggle sometimes with. Conciseness. You have to be brief, you have to be short, which makes it easy to, which makes it more easy to discuss public policy on a paradigmatic level, but not really get into the details of policy mixes and interactions between different policy elements. It's too technical, it would need too much introduction to the audience, etc., etc. This has always been true. That's why there has always been a gap in terms of content, what expert fora talk about and what public fora talk about, right? But this gap, as to say that the complexity of policy substance is increasing, this gap is also increasing because expert fora, they're well equipped to adjust and accommodate this complexity, while the public forum is not, to say the least. And finally, we think that a third pillar of the legitimacy of democratic government is evidence-based policymaking, right? So the ability to say that we're doing this and that because this is based on the best evidence we have. The problem with more and more complex policy mixes is that we're no longer interested in average policy effects, but in conditional policy effects, where we're trying to assess how the effect of one policy instrument interacting with a series of other policy instruments influences some certain outcome that we're trying to influence. Now, when we all think about interaction effects and conditional effects, they can be very tedious and difficult to interpret, even if it's just like a two-way interaction or something like that. In the real policy world, we're often talking about like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-fold interactions where different instruments interfere and interact with each other, which is obviously very difficult to communicate, which leads to a situation where experts come in, conduct very sophisticated analyses of public policy, very and increasingly sophisticated analyses of public policy, but have to communicate to decision makers. So how is that good policy? Should we go ahead? Well, that depends, right? So when we're trying to communicate interaction effects, we're always talking about conditional effects. We're talking about the different conditions under which an effect will be very strong and will be rather weak. And we argue that in such an environment, in such a communicative challenge, the challenge of communicating effective public policy is very, very difficult. Even more difficult to communicate to somebody or to come to a situation where you actually will be able to change a substantial belief of a decision makers about the effectiveness of a certain policy. So changing the predispositions or the previously held beliefs of decision makers when having to communicate such conditional effects and highly complex conditional effects, I think, or we argue, is much lower than when you're able to communicate very simple average effects. So in this process, we're arguing that this perfect way of responding to citizen demands, which leads to accumulation, has in turn 3 undermining or detrimental effects on 3 core pillars of the legitimacy of democratic government. On the one hand, the ability to implement evenly and effectively. On the other hand, or secondly, on our ability to engage in sophisticated policy debates in the public arena. And thirdly, in our ability to change decision makers' beliefs based on scientific evidence about effectiveness of public policy, which in combination, so to say, leads us to a situation where we're trying to be responsive and trying to uphold legitimacy for democratic government by being responsive, but the way in which we are responsive undermines this very same legitimacy or 3 cornerstones of this legitimacy that we're trying to build up. So this is sort of a cyclical mechanism that we're trying to describe in the book.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christian. This interview will be posted on our website and circulated through our social networks. You can find us on Twitter at JCPA_ICPA and on Facebook as the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. Thank you so much.